Welcome to our lecture on key concepts in political science. In this session, we'll explore some of the most important foundations of the discipline, ideas that shape how we think about governments, power, and political systems. We'll start by unpacking what we mean by power and authority, then move into concepts like the state and sovereignty, government and regime, democracy and authoritarianism, and finally, political ideologies. These aren't just abstract definitions, they are tools to help us make sense of real world politics. So let's begin with the cornerstone of political science, power and authority. When we think about politics, the first word that often comes to mind is power. But what exactly is power? In political science, power is the ability of an individual or group to influence others and achieve desired outcomes. It's not always about force. It can be subtle, shaping how people think or even what issues are discussed in the first place. Stephen Lukes, a political theorist, described three dimensions of power. First, there's decision making power. This is the classic idea of who wins in a political conflict, like passing a law. Second is the agenda setting power. Who gets to decide which topics are even on the table for debate? And third, ideological power, shaping people's beliefs so they accept the system as natural or legitimate. This means power can be visible, like a president signing a bill, or invisible, like cultural norms that prevent people from questioning authority. That's why political scientists study not just who holds office, but also who shapes ideas. Now, let's turn to authority. Authority is a special kind of power. It's power that is recognized as legitimate. In other words, people accept it as rightful. Think about the difference between being forced to obey versus choosing to obey because you believe the person in charge has the right to rule. That's the difference between mere power and authority. Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology, described three main types of authority. Traditional authority is rooted in customs and traditions, like monarchies that pass power through family lines. There is charismatic authority. This, this comes from the personal appeal of a leader. So figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. drew legitimacy from their extraordinary character. And finally, there is the legal rational authority. This is the kind we see in modern states. This is authority based on laws, rules, and institutions where people obey because of the office, not the person. Of these, legal rational authority tends to be the most stable because it doesn't rely on a single individual or tradition. Instead, it relies on institutions. So, what's the key difference between power and authority? Power can exist without legitimacy. For example, dictators may use military force or fear to maintain control, but people don't necessarily see that rule as rightful. On the other hand, you can have authority without much actual power. So think of a symbolic monarch or a religious leader. They may be highly respected, but they don't always control government decisions. The glue that ties this all together is legitimacy. The legitimacy is what makes authority work. So when people believe their leaders have the right to rule, they comply willingly, not just out of fear. If we compare, North Korea has immense power concentrated in the regime, but very little legitimacy beyond its borders. By contrast, Sweden has strong legitimacy where authority is accepted through democratic institutions and trust in government. There are different ways to think about how power is distributed in society. The pluralist perspective argues that power is spread across many groups, like interest groups, voters, NGOs, and democracy works because no single actor dominates. The elite perspective disagrees. It says power is concentrated in the hands of a small ruling class, whether political, economic, or military elites. The sociologist Robert uh, the sociologist Robert Michaels called this the iron law of oligarchy, the idea that all organizations, even democratic ones, eventually become ruled by elites. Finally, the Marxist perspective roots power in economics. It argues that those who control the means of production also control the state, and that political institutions ultimately serve ruling class interests. Each perspective gives us a different lens to analyze power, and no single view tells the whole story. So, why do we spend so much time on power and authority? That's because they explain how politics actually works. Power helps us answer the question, who gets what, when, and how? A phrase by political scientist Harold Laswell. Authority helps us understand why people obey governments without constant coercion. By studying both, we can better evaluate the legitimacy of political systems, understand resistance and protest, and recognize the hidden structures that shape political life. Ultimately, these concepts give us the tools to analyze not just governments, but also our role as citizens within them. Now, welcome to our section on state and sovereignty. So, in this part of the course, we will explore one of the most fundamental concepts in political science, the state itself, its authority, and what it means for a state to be sovereign. We'll discuss the core elements that define a state, examine the concept of sovereignty, and explore both classical and modern perspectives. By the end, you should understand not only what makes a state, but also the tensions and challenges sovereignty faces in the 21st century. So let's start with the basics. What is a state? Simply put, a state is a political organization that holds authority over a defined territory and its population. According to the Montevideo Convention of 1933, a state has four essential elements. First, a population. So these are people who live within the state's borders. Second, a defined territory. Third, a government, which is the system of institutions that enforces laws and makes decisions. And fourth, sovereignty, which is the supreme authority over that territory. Max Weber famously described the state as the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. This emphasizes that the state not only governs, but also controls the use of force. To make this concrete, think of France or Japan. They are recognized internationally and have stable institutions. Compare that to entities like Taiwan or Somaliland, which operate like states but face contested recognition internationally. Now, let's look at sovereignty, which is central to the concept of the state. Sovereignty refers to the supreme and independent authority a state has over its territory and population. There are two main types: internal and external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty is the state's authority within its own borders. It includes the ability to make laws, enforce them, and maintain order. External sovereignty is about recognition by other states in the international system. Membership in organizations like the United Nations signals that a state is accepted as legitimate. It's important to note that a state might have internal sovereignty but lack full external recognition, like Somaliland. This distinction shows that sovereignty is both about power at home and legitimacy abroad. Political scientists have different ways of thinking about sovereignty. Realists see states as the primary actors in international politics. They view sovereignty as absolute. The Westphalian principle of non-interference from 1648 is a classic example. For realists, any outside intervention in a state's affairs violates its sovereignty. Liberal or global perspectives, on the other hand, argue that sovereignty is increasingly shared or limited. Globalization, interdependence, and supranational organizations like the European Union challenge the idea of absolute state authority. For example, EU member states must sometimes implement laws that override national legislation. Critical theorists go further, suggesting that sovereignty is a social construct. Weak or dependent states may be sovereign in name, but they often rely heavily on external aid, influence, or intervention. Sovereignty faces many challenges in today's world. Globalization, for instance, reduces state autonomy as economies and policies become interdependent. Humanitarian interventions like NATO in Kosovo in 1999 raise ethical questions. Should sovereignty be absolute, or can it be overridden to protect civilians? Non-state actors such as multinational corporations, NGOs, and terrorist organizations increasingly influence populations and politics across borders. Cyber, cyber sovereignty is another emerging issue. Control over digital data, surveillance, and cyber warfare now tests state authority in new ways. Even powerful states must navigate these challenges, showing that sovereignty is no longer as straightforward as it once was. So, what does sovereignty look like today? Despite the pressures of globalization and technology, states remain central actors in law, security, and identity. But sovereignty is evolving. It's no longer absolute. States are expected to protect their citizens' rights, adhere to international norms, and cooperate with global institutions. This raises an important question for us to consider. Is sovereignty outdated in a globalized digital world, or does it remain the backbone of international politics? So, when you think about modern crises, from humanitarian interventions to cyber conflicts, you can see that sovereignty is both enduring and contested, making it one of the most fascinating concepts in political science. Welcome to this section on government and regime. Understanding the difference between these two concepts is crucial in political science because it helps us make sense of how political systems work, why leaders change, and why some countries are more stable than others. In the next few minutes, we'll break down what governments and regimes are, explore their characteristics, and look at different types of regimes with real world examples. Let's start by distinguishing government from regime. Think of government as the people currently in charge, the leaders, officials, and institutions who make and enforce laws. Governments change regularly, for example, after elections or after coups. Regime, on the other hand, is more like the rules of the game. It's the system that determines how leaders are chosen, how power is exercised, and what rights citizens have. Regimes are more enduring than governments and usually survive multiple changes in leadership. A simple analogy: the government is the players, the regime is the rules of the game. So, what defines the government? First, it's made up of leaders and officials who make and enforce policies. Governments can change frequently through elections, revolutions, or other political shifts. They are temporary managers of power. Their legitimacy, meaning whether citizens accept them, may vary depending on how they gain power or how they govern. For example, the US government changes every 4 to 8 years depending on elections, but the system of government remains. Now let's talk about regimes. A regime defines the framework of politics. It establishes the rules for acquiring and exercising power, the rights citizens have, and how institutions function. Regimes tend to persist across multiple governments and are more resistant to change. However, they can be reformed or collapse under major crises such as wars, revolutions, or systemic failures. Think of the Soviet Union. Leadership changed frequently, but the regime itself lasted over 70 years until it finally collapsed in 1991. Democracy is one of the most common regime types in the modern world. In a democracy, power rests with the people, either directly or through elected representatives. Key features of democratic regimes include free and fair elections, rule of law, separation of powers, and protection of civil liberties. Examples include the United States, Germany, and South Korea. Even if you don't always like the leaders, people generally accept the outcomes because the rules are trusted. Authoritarian regimes concentrate power in one leader or a small elite. Political freedoms are limited, opposition is controlled, and censorship is common. Some examples include Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Totalitarian regimes take authoritarianism further. They aim to control almost every aspect of citizens' lives, from politics, economy, culture, and even private life, often using ideology, propaganda, and surveillance. So, some classic examples include Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and modern day North Korea. Hybrid regimes, sometimes called illiberal democracies, combine elements of democracy and authoritarianism. They hold elections, but these elections are often manipulated and civil liberties are weak. Leaders maintain a democratic appearance to gain legitimacy while undermining institutions from within. Russia, Turkey, and Hungary are often cited as examples of hybrid regimes. These regimes blur the line between democracy and authoritarianism, showing how power can be maintained without fully abolishing democratic structures. Finally, why should we care about the difference between government and regime? Understanding this distinction helps us analyze political stability, predict policy outcomes, and understand citizens' rights. Governments change often, but regimes define the long-term political order. So when you hear people say the government is broken, you should remember they're talking about the current administration. But if the regime itself fails, that's a fundamental change in the political system. So, welcome to this section on democracy and authoritarianism. In this part of the course, we'll explore two major types of political systems, their key characteristics, differences, and the challenges they face today. Understanding these systems will help you analyze how governments function and how power is exercised around the world. Let's start with democracy. The word democracy comes from the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule. In simple terms, democracy is ruled by the people. But it's not just about voting. It's also about accountability, participation, and protecting rights. Abraham Lincoln once famously defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people. While democracy varies in practice, the core idea is that political power ultimately rests with the people. Democracy rests on several core elements. First, free and fair elections, where citizens can choose their leaders without intimidation. Second, the rule of law, which means that everyone, including leaders, is subject to the same legal framework. Third, civil liberties like freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Fourth, political participation, which includes voting, protests, and civic engagement. Finally, accountability and transparency, where institutions like independent judiciaries and free media act as checks on government power. For example, the Watergate scandal in the United States demonstrates how accountability mechanisms work in a democracy. So, democracy comes in different forms. First, there is direct democracy, where citizens vote directly on laws and policies. Ancient Athens is a classic example, and modern referendums like Brexit show this in action today. Second, representative democracy, where citizens elect officials to make decisions on their behalf, like the US Congress or the UK Parliament. And third, deliberative democracy, which emphasizes discussion and consensus rather than just voting. Citizen assemblies in Ireland on same sex marriage are a modern example. Most modern democracies combine these elements, making them hybrids of direct and representative forms. Authoritarianism is the opposite of democracy in many ways. In an authoritarian system, power is concentrated in the hands of one leader, a ruling party, or a small elite. Political freedoms are limited, censorship is common, and institutions are often weak. Civil society is tightly controlled, and dissent is usually suppressed. Authoritarian leaders often justify their rule by promising stability, economic growth, or national unity. China's Communist Party, for example, maintains legitimacy not through elections, but through delivering economic development and stability. Authoritarian regimes can take different forms. First, there is the personalist rule, where a single leader dominates, such as Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Second, military regimes like Myanmar after the 2021 coup. Third, single party states, where one party controls the government, as in China or North Korea. And fourth, absolute monarchies such as Saudi Arabia, where the king holds almost complete power. Each type has different methods of maintaining control and legitimacy, but all share limited political freedoms and centralization of power. Hybrid regimes, also called illiberal democracies, sit somewhere between democracy and authoritarianism. These systems hold elections, but the elections are neither free nor fair. Media may be controlled, opposition parties restricted, and the judiciary politicized. Russia under Vladimir Putin is a well-known example. Other cases include Turkey under Erdogan and Hungary under Orbán. Political scientists often call these competitive authoritarian regimes because while elections exist, they are manipulated to favor the ruling elite. Finally, let's consider some challenges and debates. Is democracy in decline? Some reports suggest a global backsliding of democratic institutions with populism and distrust in governments rising. Are authoritarian systems more stable or efficient in certain contexts? Some societies prioritize stability and economic growth over political freedoms. And finally, hybrid regimes may be becoming the new normal, combining democratic rituals with authoritarian practices. These are complex questions, and examining them critically helps us understand the dynamics of power and governance in the modern world. Welcome to our next section, political ideologies. In this section, we'll explore the major sets of beliefs that guide political thought and action around the world. Political ideologies shape how societies organize themselves, how governments operate, and how citizens understand their role in politics. Understanding ideologies will help you interpret political debates, policies, and social movements with a clearer lens. So let's dive in. Political ideologies are coherent sets of ideas and values about politics, society, and the role of government. They provide a framework for understanding the world and for guiding political action. Ideologies are normative. They tell us what should be. Explanatory. They help us understand why society works as it does. Programmatic. They offer ideas about actions. They offer ideas about what actions should be taken, and they are also identity forming. They give individuals and groups a sense of political belonging. For example, liberalism emphasizes liberty and individual rights, while socialism emphasizes equality and collective welfare. Ideologies matter because they influence the way citizens, political leaders, and policymakers see the world. They shape voting behavior, political platforms, and social movements. Historically, ideological struggles have defined major conflicts, such as the Cold War between capitalism and communism. Ideologies are not static, they evolve with changes in society, technology, and global dynamics, helping people navigate complex political issues like climate change or globalization. Liberalism emerged during the Enlightenment, influenced by thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and John Stuart Mill. Its core principles include individual rights and freedoms, consent of the governed, rule of law, and limited government intervention. Economically, liberalism favors free markets and minimal state interference, as advocated by Adam Smith. The idea that individuals, when free to pursue their own interests, sorry, the idea is that individuals, when free to pursue their own interests, contribute to a prosperous and just society. So, liberalism has several variants. You have the classical liberalism, which emphasizes minimal state intervention and laissez-faire economics. Then you have social liberalism, which supports state involvement to ensure equality of opportunity, such as welfare programs and public education. Then you have neoliberalism, which was popularized in the 1980s by leaders like Reagan and Thatcher. It focuses on market-oriented reforms, privatization, and globalization. So modern examples of liberalism include civil rights protections and free trade policies. Conservatism originated as a reaction to the French Revolution, with thinkers like Edmund Burke emphasizing the importance of tradition, order, and stability. Converse, Conservatism values strong institutions, gradual social change, and hierarchy as a natural and necessary part of society. Conservatives are generally skeptical of radical or rapid changes that could disrupt social cohesion. Conservatism also has several variants. You have the traditional conservatism, which emphasizes authority, duty, and religion. Then there is the modern conservatism, which combines support for free markets with traditional social values. Then there is the neoconservatism, particularly in the US, which emphasizes a strong military and spreading democracy abroad. Examples today include the US Republican Party or the UK Conservative Party, which balance market policies with respect for tradition. Socialism emerged in response to the Industrial Revolution, with thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels advocating for greater economic equality. Socialism emphasizes collective ownership or regulation of the economy, redistribution of wealth, and social justice. The goal is to reduce inequality and provide all members of society with access to essential resources. Socialism comes in different forms. We have the Marxist socialism or communism. It advocates for class struggle and the abolition of private property. Then we have the democratic socialism, which combines democratic governance with extensive welfare systems, as seen in Scandinavian countries. Social democracy supports a market economy but emphasizes strong social protections. Modern examples include universal healthcare and progressive taxation policies. Then we have fascism. Fascism emerged in interwar Europe with leaders like Mussolini and Hitler advocating ultra-nationalism and authoritarian leadership. Core beliefs include rejection of democracy, glorification of the state and leader, militarism, and suppression of dissent. Fascism often rises during periods of economic or social crisis, offering a myth of national rebirth and unity. Historically, fascism is most clearly seen in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. In a modern context, far-right nationalist movements may also echo fascist ideas, such as xenophobia, strongman leadership, or suppression of political opposition. Understanding fascism is important to recognize threats to both democracy and to human rights. Then we have feminism. So, feminism is a political ideology focused on achieving gender equality and critiquing patriarchal systems. Feminism has evolved in waves. The first wave fought for legal equality, like voting rights. The second wave focused on workplace rights and reproductive freedom. The third wave emphasized diversity and intersectionality. And the fourth wave today uses digital activism to combat harassment and inequality. So there are multiple forms of feminism. We have the liberal feminism, which seeks equal rights and opportunities. There is the radical feminism, which emphasizes dismantling of patriarchal structures. Then there is the intersectional feminism, which highlights overlapping oppressions based on race, class, gender, and other factors. Modern examples include gender quotas in politics and campaigns for equal pay. Environmentalism emerged strongly in the 1960s and 1970s, inspired by works like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Core beliefs include sustainability, ecological responsibility, and the protection of natural resources. Environmentalists critique industrial capitalism for its environmental impact and advocate for policies that preserve ecosystems for future generations. Environmentalism also has diverse approaches. Conservatism focuses on sustainable use of natural resources. Deep, ecolo- Deep ecology promotes radical rethinking of human-nature relationships. Eco-socialism links environmental issues to social and economic inequalities. Some modern examples include green parties, climate change activism, and international agreements like the COP summits. So, political ideologies are essential because they provide structure to political debate, they inspire political parties and movements, and shape domestic and international policies. They adapt to new challenges, including globalization, climate change, and technological transformation. And understanding ideologies helps us interpret politics critically and participate more meaningfully in society. So think of ideologies as the grammar of politics. Without them, political debates can seem chaotic or incomprehensible. The end.